Good morning and welcome back to RC Truth Media. Today we're going to be going over some history on the United States. We have had a theme that has been going on ever since the beginning of U.S. history, since the United States has become a nation. And that theme would be growing the federal government, growing the power, size, and scope of government to make a military industrial complex that would no doubt benefit the United States in all ways. And the goal was, since the very beginning, to expand the size, the scope, and get as much land as you possibly can for all of the goods that you can acquire from around the world. They wanted to pursue their economic interest. The U.S. wanted to benefit their economic interest uh, from all over the world. And they did this by installing dictators, by funneling money and funneling arms over to these regimes, whichever one that gave into the economic system of the U.S. that benefited the U.S. in any way, they would go ahead and do this. And they did this by saying the whole what they did was they told everybody, the United States, all the people, and they told the world that they were trying to free the sovereign people. It was all about freeing and bringing liberty to these people. But really, all they wanted to do was pursue their economic interests, like gas, oil, gold, silver, these types of things. Okay, so ever since the 1790s, James Madison had predicted for many years to come the danger to individual liberty would lie in abuse of power by Congress. This is why the Bill of Rights barred Congress, not the president or the states, from abridging civil liberties. Madison said the president might pose the biggest threat, the greatest danger. In war, he wrote, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. No nation, Madison believed, could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. We've been in continual warfare now for almost 20 years. And pretty much since the start of the U.S., the United States has entered and pursued these wars. Okay, um, ever since the beginning. Okay, so that was in 1790s. Now I'm going to start off with the World War II. Okay, we're going to start off with World War II and we're going to work our way towards today. So January 6, 1941, President Roosevelt spoke in his State of the Union address. He spoke of a future world order founded on the essential human freedoms, those freedoms I was talking about. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. The four freedoms became Roosevelt's favorite statement of Allied aims. His favorite statement to all the other nations to try to get allies was to liberate these people and bring freedoms, the four freedoms he was talking about. He compared this statement, the freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom of fear, the four freedoms. He compared this with the Magna Carta and the Ten Commandments. As during World War One, on a larger scale, though, the war mobilization expanded the size and scope of government and energized the economy. The war production conquered the Great Depression. Remember how the United States got into a Great Depression in the 30s? Well, this conquered that. The demand for labor drew millions of women into the workforce. It sent a tide of migrants to the West and the North, permanently altering the nation's social geography. The war created a close link between big business and a militarized federal government. A military industrial complex was coined. That term was coined by President Eisenhower. The U.S. lent its support to dictators like Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua. They said he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. Franklin Roosevelt said that, FDR. In 1940, Germany had taken over the European continent and was trying to take over the world with its fascist dictator, uh, Adolf Hitler, of course. And to stop the rise of fascism, U.S. allied with France and Britain. December 7th, 1941, Japanese plane bombed the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Roosevelt he committed to liberating Europe from Nazi control. Because of World War II, it's transformed the role of the national government. FDR created federal agencies to regulate the allocations of labor, controlling of shipping industry lanes. He fixed wages, prices, and rents during this time. The number of federal workers rose from 1 to 4 million. The government built housing for war workers and forced civilian industries to retool for war production. That means a lot of these industries changed from uh, doing things for activities and for pleasure to being war producers. Okay, that's what was in, and that's what was making the money. And so most of the money, big time money, was for producing manufacturing for the war. Okay, and they also introduced the income tax during this time. Before World War II, only the 4 million wealthiest Americans paid the income tax. After World War II, and starting in World War II, FDR inserted the income tax for all Americans, and after World War II, they just kept it. Okay, so let's talk about 45 through 1953, the United States and the Cold War. The only power that could rival the U.S. during this time was the Soviet Union. We had already defeated Germany, um, and now it's Soviet Union during this time, who was a great threat to United States and their communist rulers. Okay, so their armies occupied most of Eastern Europe, including Eastern Germany. So, in the Truman Doctrine, President Truman in 1947 of March described the Cold War as a worldwide struggle over the future of freedom. Here's this freedom again. Now, what were they trying to do? Stop the rise of communism and pursue United States economic interest. So, in Turkey and Germany, the Soviet Union was threatening to take over the area, which it's really close. Germany and Soviet Union is really close, right? But here we are, U.S., way far away from all this, and it's a threat to us. Okay, so what happened was, again, Soviet Union was trying to take over Turkey and Germany, and this area was of importance to the U.S. because it was the gateway to southeastern Europe and the oil-rich Middle East. Anti-communism was used to undermine the rights of citizens during this time. Why? What happened during this time? The size and scope of government grew again. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover developed files on thousands of American citizens, including political dissenters. That means people who disagree with the public or with the political opinions, okay, of the people in office. They also got files on homosexuals and others who had no connection to communism. In 1956, during the Cold War, U.S. replaced Britain as the dominant Western power in the Middle East, and American companies increasingly dominated the region. U.S. was to defend the Middle East. That's what they said, right? The U.S. was to defend the Middle East against communism or Arab nationalism. That means Arab nationalism is like how we have nationalism here, how we do the Pledge of Allegiance and how we are stand up for Americans, and we're proud to be Americans. Okay, they couldn't have Arab nationalism over there, so the U.S. was supposed to defend against that. So what did they do? They replaced the Masada with the Shah of Iran and agreed to give British and American oil companies 40% of his nation's oil revenues. This Shah of Iran did, okay? In 1961, the Soviets set up missiles in Cuba that could have hit the U.S., but the Kennedy administration imposed a blockade or a quarantine on Cuba and demanded the missiles' removal. This is a quarantine is basically they stopped trading with Cuba, and ever since, Cuba has been 50 years behind the United States, literally. They barely got computers on their cell phones. 50% of the country barely has cell phones today. This is because the Cuba tried to let Soviet Union come in and set up missiles, and U.S. definitely has paid them back for it. After the French defeat, okay, the French were trying to come in and take control of Vietnam, and they got defeated. The United States was funneling money to France because France was trying to grow their empire, and they got defeated, and so they financed, the U.S. financed the creation of a pro-American South Vietnamese government. in violation of the Geneva Accords of 54. So there was a Geneva Accords where U.S. promised to unify Vietnam and to not do anything about their unification under communism. And what happened? They went against this, and they set up a pro-American South Vietnamese government. Okay. Now that was in 54. They violated that. Now we're gonna go to the 70s under Nixon. Okay, we're gonna skip the 60s. Basically, what happened in the 60s? I'll tell you a little bit about that right now. It was the peace movement in the 60s. There was opposition to the war, became the organizing theme that united the people. That was when you had these hippies, you had all kinds of free liberating movements, you had the gay rights come out, civil rights come out, all kinds of different women's rights came out during this time. But everybody had to go to war. Only way you got exempt from war is if you were a college student, and it was really expensive to go to college during this time. But that's the only way you got exempt. So they're talking about freeing, and it's kind of a hypocrisy type thing. They're talking about freeing and liberating people that are thousands of miles away, but you're taking away your freedoms here to go to war, right? So this is what they had to go through. During the 60s, anti-communism led the U.S. deeper and deeper into the Vietnam conflict. Now we go to the 70s. What happened? 70s was Nixon. He funneled arms to dictators and pro-American regimes like Iran, the Philippines, and South Africa. After Chile elected a socialist president, Sal Allende, the CIA worked with his domestic opponents to destabilize the regime. On September 11th, 1973, Sal Allende was overthrown and killed in a military coup in which the U.S. installed a bloody dictator under General Augusto Pinochet. In 1973, after an estimated $100 billion spent on Vietnam, Nixon finally negotiated the Paris Peace Agreement, where Americans withdrew from South Vietnam and Vietnam was reunited under communist rule. So this was definitely a loss for America. They were reunited under communism. In 1976, President Carter was elected. He committed to promoting human rights. It became his centerpiece to American foreign policy. So here we are, the freedoms. Remember the four freedoms that was once said by Franklin Roosevelt. Now we are with President Carter in into the 70s, also talking about protecting human rights. Pretty similar. In 1978, Carter cut off aid to Argentina when Argentina's dictator engaged in human rights violations by murdering 30,000 of their own people. He turned a blind eye to human rights violations by his Cold War allies, though. The foreign policy was changed from Cold War thinking to human rights abroad, combating poverty, preventing spread of nuclear weapons. Carter criticized American arms sales to the rest of the world, but with thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in corporate profits, he did nothing to stop them. The U.S. continued its support of allies with records of serious human rights violations, such as the governments of Guatemala, the Philippines, South Korea, and Iran. By 1980, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were engaged in a 10-year guerrilla warfare, where the Soviets were basically engaged in a new South Vietnam in Afghanistan. The Soviets sent thousands of troops to Afghanistan to try to take over the area and pursue their economic interest. And this was not going to fly with the U.S. Carter announced the Carter Doctrine. U.S. would use military force to protect its interest. Okay, so it's all about protecting its interests, not really about pursuing the freedom. They wanted to protect their interests in the Persian Gulf. It says it right there. This is all coming from a history book, by the way, my United States history book. So in the 80s, the United States funneled aid to fundamentalist Muslims. The alliance had an unforeseen consequence. A faction of Islamic fundamentalists was known as the Taliban eventually came to power in Afghanistan. The Taliban were as hostile to the U.S. as Moscow. Now remember, we were the ones that created these Talibans, okay, by funneling aid to these fundamentalist Muslims. That's what happened. Without that aid, they would have never got there. Ronald Reagan in the 80s, Reagan came into office determined to end the Cold War, the Vietnam Syndrome. He sent troops to the Caribbean island of Grenada to oust a pro-Cuban government. he ordered the bombing of Libya in retaliation for the country's alleged involvement in a terrorist attack at a West Berlin nightclub in which one American died. So let me get this straight. One American died, and he goes and bombs Libya, right? Which hundreds of people, if not thousands, probably died there. In 1985, Reagan secretly authorized the sale of arms to Iran, which was then involved in a war with its neighbor Iraq, in order to release a number of American hostages that were held by Islamic groups in the Middle East. So he gave them all kinds of guns and ammunition so that we could release some hostages. At the end of 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. In 1990, the regions of the Soviet Union were then 15 new independent nations. Germany was reunified under democracy. In 1989, George H.W. Bush brought back the days of American interventionism in the Western Hemisphere. Here they go again, breaking into sovereign nations to pursue their interest. At the end of '89, George H.W. Bush dispatched troops to Panama to overthrow the government of General Manuel Anton Noriega, a former ally of the U.S. who had become involved in the international drug trade. The invasion cost the lives of over 3,000 Panamanians and was condemned by the United Nations as a violation of international law. The administration deemed it a success, though. The U.S. installed a new government in Panama and sent Noriega to jail for life. Okay, so this is in the 80s. Then we get President Clinton's terms, I should say. During Clinton's presidency, human rights played an increasingly important role in international affairs. Hundreds of non-governmental agencies defined themselves as defenders of civil rights. The Rwanda genocide produced a UN-sponsored human war crimes court that sentenced the country's former prime minister to prison for life. When Clinton was in office, the most complex foreign policy crisis arose from the disintegration of Yugoslavia. Ethnic cleansing was being done. Serbs in Bosnia launched a war aimed at driving out Muslims and Croatians. By the end of 1993, more than 100,000 Bosnians had been killed. With the Cold War over, protection of human rights gave NATO a new purpose. Human rights emerged as a justification for intervention in matters of sovereign nations. The U.S. dispatched the military to distant parts of the world to assist in international missions to protect civilians. Despite adopting human rights as a slogan, many governments continued to violate them in practice. Now, September 11, 2011, we all know what happened there. Hijackers seized control of 4 jet airliners filled with passengers. They crashed into the World Trade Center. Aftermath of September 11th, the Bush administration announced a war on terrorism. After the September 11th attacks in 2002, the Bush administration released a document called the National Security Strategy. It replaced the Cold War doctrine with a new one, preemptive war. If the U.S. believed that a nation posed a possible threat to its sovereignty, then the U.S. would intervene. By 2002, the U.S. maintained military bases throughout the world and deployed its navy on every ocean. Also in the aftermath of September 11th, Congress rushed to pass the Patriot Act, which confirmed unprecedented powers on law enforcement agencies charged with preventing the new vaguely defined crime of domestic terrorism, including the power to wiretap, spy on citizens, open letters, read emails, and obtain personal records from third parties like college libraries without permission of a suspect. Soon after 9/11, President Bush authorized the NSA to eavesdrop on Americans' telephone conversations without a court warrant. This is a clear violation of the law that limits the NSA to foreign intelligence gathering. So you could see what has happened. Okay, the powers of the president during war has helped them to pursue their interests, which is, what is Bush's interest? Growing the one world order, one world government, getting the federal government so powerful that it can spy on their citizens and break the First Amendment, Second Amendment. They're trying to take away our guns. All this is started from the Democrats, right? And a lot of these Republicans are also on the team as well. You know, we have very few that are in there that are against this one world order type deal, which is trying to bring basically the elites that were in the system, these globalists, these bad guys that were been in control for a long time, trying to rule the world under under their ridiculousness. And we're taking these bad guys out, that's for sure. But you see what has been happening, okay? They grew the police state, they grew the size and scope of the federal government, tried to take our Bill of Rights away one by one, just taking our sovereignty away, and we're tired of it, you know. And this is the time where we get our sovereignty back. It's the time of Aquarius now, okay? Everybody's awakening to all this crap, and we're done with it. We want to let you know we know the bullshit. We know the true history. Okay, so go out there and spread the true history and do something about it. Thanks a lot. What can you do? Go grab gold, silver, Bitcoin, cryptos. Not too much though. Right now they're at the dip, so it's a good time to buy. But definitely gold and silver. They've been a store of wealth for thousands of years. Go grab you some. Take care. Hope you learned something out of this. RC Truth Media is over now.